Good morning. Saturday, October 24th, about 1 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I should be asleep, but I'm not. I want to talk. So let's. Today's October 24th, and 151 days ago was the first of 151 consecutive days of the George Floyd protests in the United States. Now, one of the longest lasting protests in United States history, the longest lasting protest, not demonstration, is a anti-nuclear proliferation vigil that's been observed since the 1981, I think, outside the White House, and has gone without having that vigil broken for the entirety of that time. So it's not the longest, but it is by an overwhelming margin the largest protest in terms of scope, in terms of what cities have been affected, number of people involved, and its duration, dwarfing any protest, sustained or otherwise, in United States history. And yes, I do mean to talk about the protests against Vietnam, protests and demonstration for black rights and civil rights, the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom had an estimated 250,000 to 300,000 attendees. The moratorium to end the war in Vietnam, 1969 famed March on D.C., had 500,000. This year alone, we have had a minimum of 15 million protesters, unique protesters in the United States. Conservative estimates go as high as 26 million, though the real number is probably significantly higher than that. The United States population is 328.2 million people. I want you to consider that of those 328.2 million people, 26 million in the midst of maybe the worst pandemic that this country has borne witness to or suffered from. 26 million people have still been out on the streets to protest against police violence, against institutionalized racism, for black lives, and really for the dignity of all American lives. I have taken no satisfaction or pleasure in my commenting and reporting since March about how bad this pandemic would get and will get. I have taken no pleasure in assessing time and time again the scope, longevity, tenacity of the protesters, myself included, in this political moment. I have exhaustively talked about its importance time and time again, its magnitude time and time again, and encouraged people to get involved. I want you to think about that number. 26 million. Again, a conservative estimate. If that's true, 8% of the population of the United States, 8% of the entire population of the United States have participated in these protests. The next largest protests were the 2017 Women's March, which at most drew 5.6 million. That was one day. One day. It was absolutely an impressive sight to see that many people out for one day, but they didn't come back the next day. So many of them went home and didn't commit to continuing the fight and the struggle for the causes that they were marching for. A lot of people did. But seeing as the testimony of Tara Reid and other sexual assault victims like her had been disregarded by self-respecting human beings on both sides of the American political system, those making assault claims against Donald Trump and those against Joe Biden have been characteristically by either party dismissed, discredited, and otherwise silenced. The United States has a long history. In comparison to our friends, neighbors, forebearers, we have a short history. A short history of capitalism, of slavery, genocide, of republicanism, of enterprise, of innovation, of hope, exploitation, labor, tired voices crying out for a better world, and police batons silencing them. We have, as a nation, begrudgingly at times made steps towards a more perfect union. We have mitigated and modestly reformed our sins to our brothers and sisters whose only crime was being born in a continent different from ours. And we have made no substantial punishments to the people who, in their vanity, and sadistic self-interest, thought themselves so superior as to own another human being. This wasn't just for a few years. The earliest colonies in the United States had slaves. And it was only after hundreds of years of protest, hundreds of years of agitation, hundreds of years of arguments, that inevitably the issue was settled through violence. Because when confronting power, real institutional power, you will be met with violence. You will consistently, methodically be met with violence. I just finished watching the Chicago 7. I knew the story, the history. Watching that was very difficult. The scenes, the dramatized scenes as well as the archival footage of police brutality is visceral. Not in the sense that, wow, it was so terrible back then, but in the sense of nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. Except now, so many people seem contented to pretend like it isn't happening every day. That we had more days of tear gas this summer in Seattle than we had days of sunshine. Right? That my city summer was characterized by police brutality, tear gas, a broken political system geared toward adhering to and serving the capitalist class, characterized by wildfires running unchecked because federal government's interest is not in making sure that this planet can be inhabited by later generations, but rather in enriching the current entrenched elite. I want to project determination, strength, tenacity. I'm not. I'm tired. I wept through watching that fucking Netflix movie. The more I read about the history of protests in the United States, the history of the civil rights movement, the history of the Civil War, the abolition of slavery, the more I realize, to my disgust and everlasting horror, that things have not improved. Things have been mitigated. Hurt has been mitigated. What is it that Malcolm X said? You take a knife, you stab it into my back, you pull it out 3 inches. That's not enough because you still stabbed me, you still have the wound. If you pull it out 1 inch or 2 inch, reform is not enough so long as the wound persists. Not his exact words, but the intent's still the same. We are a people festering in untreated wounds, untreated illnesses. We are sick. And this year has convinced me thoroughly that it might be mortally so. I have such little faith that a country to be proud of will pull itself from what we're in. I don't think that this pandemic will kill everyone. No, far from it. Human species has survived far worse epidemics in its history. That's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about our attitude, our national spirit. I'm worried that we seem to have accepted that there are acceptable losses for capitalism, not in the abstract, That, oh yeah, corporations take advantage of people. All profit is derived from unpaid or subpaid labor. At least that's obfuscated enough, or academic enough, that you could hope that maybe you explain it to people, you teach it to people, and they can understand. You can change their hearts and minds. But there are people out there who are seeing human beings protesting for the rights to not be murdered in broad daylight by police officers on camera. There are people who see people protesting for the basic right to life and dignity, threatening violence, mortal violence against those protesters, suggesting vehicular assault and homicide against those protesters. And you might say, sure, there are fringe groups, but it's not fringe groups. It's not. And that's the ugly wound that we need to talk about as a nation. It's not just a few bad apples. God, is that analogy not overused? Uptime's about 17 minutes. Moobot's dead. Long live Moobot. I'm up at 1 a.m., thank you, because I don't know, everything's terrible. This country has an untreated wound that has festered for, God, almost 200 years now. At the end of the Civil War, the Reconstruction period was intended by the administration that installed it to make it so that the rights of African Americans in the former Confederate States were protected. That they were given 40 acres and a mule, right? Guaranteed jobs, guaranteed the right to vote, guaranteed access to voting polls. And really, the point of Reconstruction was to integrate African Americans into American society and to deter, stop, violently, if need be, efforts by Confederates and other Dixies to forestall that great and admirable effort. The administration's determination at the time was so strong that these states were not considered parts of the United States anymore. They were occupied territories, which were in fact occupied by the United States Army, whose charge it was to protect the lives of African Americans in the southern states of the United States of America. Unfortunately, this is where the great weakness of our republic shows its head. Because the next administration thought it was politically unpopular, that people did not want their white sons fighting other white sons for black lives, that slavery was abolished, that was good enough, and that those good old Yankee boys should come on home. So the work of Reconstruction was left incomplete. Wildly, inadequately incomplete. There were programs to educate former slaves, to increase the literacy of the South, to introduce food programs, housing programs, to distribute government-owned property, to acquire property from former slave owners and redistribute those to their slaves. There were properties for job education, skills trade for former slaves to see that they could be integrated into a more industrialized economy. that these ground layers had envisioned for the South. And when we talk about the 14th Amendment, we talk about the abolition of slavery in this country, it is, as always, important to note that slavery was never actually abolished in its entirety in the United States. I say in its entirety because the 14th Amendment makes a very notable exception. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction unequal protection of the laws, etc., etc. The part that you care about, right? The part that got introduced in 1968 and was so exciting was not that first section, but oh my god, am I thinking about the 13th Amendment? Wait. No, right? Yeah, this is the 14th Amendment. Essentially, in the 14th Amendment, there is a place where it says that the abolishment of slavery, right? But it doesn't actually abolish slavery. It abolishes slavery except for as punishment for a crime. And I'm tired, it's late, and I'm not Googling until I find it. 14th Amendment, prison, waiver. It was the 13th Amendment, not the 14th Amendment. That's why I couldn't find it. Way to go, Alex. But yeah, slavery in the United States has never actually been completely removed. Yeah, 13th Amendment. Neither slavery through nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or in any place subject to their jurisdiction. Essentially, no slavery except if the government does it. It's a big loophole. And in the following decades, after Union began to pull out of the South, immediately, what happened was that states began to make it illegal for African Americans to participate in white society in the South, introducing Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws purportedly had the intention of creating a separate but equal society for African Americans in the South, though in reality the intent in effect was to criminalize, in as many ways as possible, being African American, and moving as much of that population as possible into prison confinement, where, in adherence with respect to the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, their labor could once again be used without pay. Not enslaved to individual slave masters, but to state and federal masters. The Transcontinental Railroad was one of many projects during this time that was built using slave labor. Both slave labor imported from China and slave labor of African American work teams bought on contract from the prisons in the South of the United States. This is a matter of record. Twitch go down? My god. It may have. Wow, look you here. No internet? You're wrong about that, but have at it. It's just... Those Jim Crow laws then existed for the next better part of a century, until the 1960s, when they were whittled back more and more. But the institution of the prison industrial complex, as it would come to be termed, I think by Angela Davis, would continue unabated. Though there were noteworthy attempts to obfuscate its profitability, the prison industrial complex has become a renowned and well-noted hallmark of American economics. Racism did not end in the 1960s, or 70s, or 80s, or 90s. Changing laws to forbid discrimination does not change the people in power who enabled that discrimination prior to the establishment of that laws or engaged in that discrimination prior to the establishment of those laws. It does not undo the decades and centuries of work done to disown a people from the fruits of their labor, to deny them the right to dignity and a life. In the 90s, I always, as a kid, honestly found it strange and off-putting how much of a fake artificial sweetener effort was made to shoehorn in minorities into every facet of media possible, from textbooks to television shows. And none of it was done with any intention to show true diversity, but the illusion of diversity. To give the impression of diversity, that we're all the same, that I don't see color, that race and ability and class are not issues in this country, that we're all the same, and we all have the same rights and freedoms and potential. Even as a kid, I knew it was a lie. Even as a kid, I knew they were just actors. They were just models. That it was fake. And that real people weren't like that. I lacked the vocabulary to really express it. So instead, I directed my confusion and my cognitive dissonance and the uncanny valley effect I was feeling in unproductive modes. I'm angry, and I think I grow angrier with every passing year, because the great lie told to my generation was that all of these problems have been fixed. And these vainglorious sons of bitches, who now own more wealth than the prior generations before them, and their descendant generations, mine included. These sons of bitches, the baby boomers particularly, but really just the owning class in the United States, had the audacity to raise my generation on this auspice of equality. We all had the same opportunities. It was all based on merit, on intellect, on will. That, they'd done the hard work in the 60s so that we could have the world in the 90s and the 2000s. And we should thank the people who fought in the 40s and the 30s. The people who fought in the 1860s. The truth is, they didn't solve everything. They didn't really solve anything. They put band-aids on situations. They alleviated tension momentarily. They made concessions. But the wound has not been healed. The redlining of districts, housing, and businesses in United States cities that dictated where people possessing different levels of melanin in their skin could or could not live have gone on to have a material legacy impacting the lives of newborns born in this very day and age. We are not all equal. We are not all free. That is the truth of America. That is the truth of the United States. We are not all free. And God, it makes me so angry. That it was ever professed to be that way. That was ever professed to be so. Because I spent so many years of my life in this contentment that things were okay. I was blind for decades. And in all those years, I could have been a better friend. I could have been a better ally. I could have been a better human being if I had just known the cards that we had been dealt. If I had just known what we were up against. Things did not have to get this bad. Things don't have to get worse. They don't. But they will. It's heartbreaking and frustrating. Truthfully, it's infuriating and enraging. And the voice of that rage and the voice of that frustration were echoed in every major city in the United States for the last 151 days. It's not my frustration alone. Right now, it seems as if we are seeing an all-time high in voter turnout. It's encouraging, right? Except, truthfully, we've not really been given much of an option as to what to vote on. The paths presented to us are a return to normalcy. A normalcy of a neoliberal vision for the United States as offered to us by the Democratic Party. By the Democratic Party, I mean the Democratic Party of the 90s, early 2000s. Not the party of Ocasio-Cortez, not the party of Omar, not the party of Sanders. The party of Clinton. The party of Obama. And yes, the party of Biden and Harris. Corporatists. We are being offered corporatists. Or fascists. And I don't use the word fascist lightly. But the tactics of the Republican Party have increasingly become ones of voter suppression, anti-democratic suppression. anti-Republican suppression, making less people vote. Fixing the layouts of districts is to predetermine the outcome of elections based on the constituents within that districts. Limiting the voices of people from certain political backgrounds and megaphoning people from others. Selectively, decisively deciding whose voice gets heard, whose voice doesn't. That was bad enough. But now, this administration doesn't disown police violence done at a scale honestly never before seen in American history. Oh, we've seen violence like this for a weekend here, a week there, maybe a month or two in the summer of '69. Not for 151 fucking days. It's not much of a choice, is it, right? This massive turnout supporting corporate Democrats like those like Jenny Durkin. And the mayors of Portland, Chicago, New York, and every other major city of the United States that is all but taken up arms at this point. And a hoarse, desperate call that Black Lives Matter. Many liberals don't understand the frustration of progressives and leftists in having to vote for Biden and Kamala Harris. They think that we can push Biden to the left. Or Kamala. Fuck off. You assholes, we've been fighting an entire summer, half of a year, half of a goddamn year, against corporate Democrats whose police have beaten us, tear gassed us, shot us, arrested us on false charges, who have started police riots, who have infiltrated protests in attempts to instigate violence, wasted more taxpayer money than the entirety of damages caused by the most violent incidents of this summer, multiplied by a factor of a significant number. We're not excited about voting for Biden because he too is our oppressor. And all we're going to see is a return to the foundation of Black Lives Matter and the Obama administration, to Flint going ignored year after year after year, of the downtrodden of our country making headline news and then being forgotten about, being given token gestures and speeches and campaigns, but never meaningfully, materially assisted. We're going to see a continuation of the abandonment of the American worker. White or black, red or blue collar, Yankee, Dixie, it doesn't fucking matter. They don't give a shit about us. They haven't for a long time, if they ever did. The only future is one of reform, progress, and revolution. The only future. Because if we do not have reform, if we do not have progress, if we do not have revolution, we will have death. we will have hundreds of thousands more dying from COVID-19. Today, as a matter of fact, we had the single highest infection rate yet in a single day. I should say yesterday, the 23rd of October. And with winter approaching, it's likely to get worse. I had hoped at the beginning of this we might just be smart, do what damn near every other major nation on Earth did. Just quarantine for a fucking month, bite the bullet, and come back. No, we didn't have the determination, the love for our neighbors, and the love of human life, happiness to do that. Instead, we had to adhere to panicked investors, brokers, worrying about the economy, throwing hundreds of thousands of Americans off of the altar of capitalism in this fucking death cult that we live in. Make no mistake, it is a death cult. So long as people continue to work, they continue to get sick, they continue to die. By and large, in a completely unnecessary fashion. We are entirely capable, like so many other nations, of shutting down almost the entirety of our economy, moving a substantial portion of it online, and enforcing adequate protection for those jobs which can't be virtualized. We have that capacity. We have that capacity because we have the capacity to militarize every goddamn police force in the country. We have the capacity to militarily occupy more than 2/3 of the planet. Have military bases in damn near every country on Earth. We have the capacity to have ended this. But it would have hurt that Dow Jones, would have hurt that line, and that line is more important than any human life. Maybe even all human life. The great wound of our society will not be healed until every American is guaranteed shelter, food, free and equal access to education and work. No one, absolutely no one in this country should be worrying about where their next meal is coming from. No one, absolutely no one in this country should worry if they will have a bed to sleep in tomorrow. If they will have a shelter over their head. These are not commodities. These are necessary things to guarantee human life and survival. These are not things by which we should profit from one another. These are things by which we should guarantee one another. For the welfare of humanity, for the welfare of humankind. Because the right to life is the first fundamental right outlined in our Constitution. Even higher than liberty. But liberty has such a fantastic tin to it. Beautiful ring like that of a church bell that we fixate on it. And we forget the first. We send thousands to die in foreign wars to kill tens or hundreds of thousands of other people to guarantee American companies or their associates move those goods or materials to the United States or its manufacturing holdings overseas at reduced cost, we don't care for life. Not really. When a once-in-a-century disease strikes the United States, we sacrifice hundreds of thousands, more than in any war the United States has ever fought in. Any war the United States has ever fought in. We don't protect human lives by expanding Medicare for all. It's an emergency measure until the crisis is over. Minimum. You could have just done that. We don't guarantee that people can't have their homes foreclosed or lose their apartments or rentals because they're out of a job. We don't even guarantee that every American gets food. We offered a one-time $1,200 payment to certain individuals. There are still Americans who haven't received that. Oh, there was an expansion to the unemployment program so long as you fit very specific requirements. And the arbitrary constraints of the system approved you. If they didn't, if your reason for leaving your job or not having a job wasn't good enough, fuck you. It's noteworthy that unemployment may have been expanded, but people who are disabled, people who cannot be on unemployment because they are physically unable to work, or mentally unable to work, to my knowledge, did not receive a similar expansion to their benefits, nor did we see an expansion to Social Security in this time to guarantee that the most vulnerable victims, most vulnerable members of our society, the elderly, that they would be protected, that they wouldn't have to take on second jobs, part-time or otherwise, that they wouldn't have to go out and put themselves at risk. We haven't seen an expansion of coverage of our veterans. We haven't seen a damn fucking thing. We've seen unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented bailouts of corporations. We have tripled our debt. Is that right? We've put trillions and more into our debt just from bailouts alone. Bailouts that didn't go to the American people. Bailouts that went to companies in the hopes that it would keep those companies afloat and those companies would continue to pay their employees. What those companies did was continue to lay off those employees and use that money for stock buybacks so that they could get their stocks at a reduced cost and sell them later for profit. Because corporations in the United States are under no obligation to care for their employees. That's the government's job. And it's not doing it. And this is where it's easy to point fingers and say, oh, the Democrats this, oh, the Republicans that. No, neither of them. Neither party showed up in any meaningful capacity to offer meaningful aid to the American people. Sanders did. Sanders and a few progressive Democrats offered fairly reasonable proposals, but let's be honest, it doesn't matter. Because the people in office are enriched by this inequality, and are entrenched by this inequality, and are supported by this inequality, or the people who benefit from it. This situation is not improving because the people who have the power to improve it are not affected by it negatively. This is an investment dream. We are bordering on the worst homeless crisis, housing crisis, I should say, in United States history, as foreclosures continue to close in, as evictions continue to close in, and deadlines on that forbid foreclosures or evictions are ticking closer and closer to their end, in some cases without signs of renewal or extension. There are no statistics. Good comparative statistics, anyway, to talk about the severity of the Great Depression of the early 20th century in the United States or abroad. There are abstracts, there are ways to measure its impact on gross domestic product, but census data from back then was frankly terrible. We have no idea how bad that really got, and it did get bad. So it's going to be very hard to say when things now get worse. But seriously, unless something changes by January, it's going to get worse. Unemployment in the United States is at an all-time high. There are estimates that 26% of the American workforce is out of work right now. Now, unemployment numbers are only showing, 15%, I think? 10-15%, and that's off, and I've talked about this before because of the way that's measured. That even people who are considered employed because they have at least part-time or contract work, or they are self-employed, aren't necessarily counted as unemployed. Right now, I don't count as unemployed, even though I have no job, and even though I'm looking for work. The unemployment office has decided I'm not unemployed because I don't meet certain criteria, because my moral and ethical reasons for leaving my employer, i.e. that they expected me to discriminate against homeless people who committed no crime. They were just near the property. The property had suffered break-ins from criminals doing some notable damage. But that's par for a course in a city. These criminals were not homeless, did not appear to be homeless. But in order to satisfy the homeowners board, a new policy was made that the staff, the concierge staff, particularly me, and especially me as I worked overnights and was one of the senior staff members, were to call the police on any homeless person seen near the property if they were sleeping on the sidewalk, in the alleyway, if they were stopping and loitering. I was to call the police. It's worth mentioning and clarifying here that by Seattle City law, it is not illegal for a human being to sleep in the street, so long as they are on public property. So I used the pandemic as an excuse to tender my resignation early, as I didn't want to get sick and die for pieces of shit like the people at the Vine. Now, there are good people there, but people with that much money coming together to hide themselves away from the rest of the world, setting up expectations of harassing the people in this city with the absolute least. No, you're not good people at that point. Not by a long fucking shot. But there are a couple of nicer, older people there with no real sway in the HOA. They're good. There are a couple good people. But, God. Yeah, but no, I don't count as unemployed, even though I haven't had a job since the end of March. My mother doesn't count as unemployed because she runs, in a way, her own business. It doesn't take into account how much people are making every month, unemployment. It doesn't take into account if people are making a livable wage, a real livable wage, not minimum wage, but a real livable wage, taking into consideration the cost of utilities, housing, etc., etc. When we look at the real poverty rate of the United States, it is easily double what it's purported to be. The official United States poverty rate is somewhere around 13% right now. This time last year, it was around 10.5%. And again, remember, that's official. That doesn't take into consideration the real living cost of being in the United States. The federal poverty level is that in a two-person household, you make $718 a month per person before tax. That's not a livable wage. So the poverty rate is probably 50%. I'll stop at an hour. How about that? So 4 more minutes of me just talking into the night here. There's no conclusion here. There's no real call to action. You've heard it time and time again. Join the fucking Democratic Socialists of America. Literally, it's pay whatever you can afford. Organize with friends and family for action plans for what happens if the President of the United States decides that after the election he won't stand down. He won't resign. Make action plans for how you're going to protect your friends and neighbors from this worsening economic crisis, from this worsening health crisis, because the government is not coming to save you. They're not. They have had ample opportunity. In March, in April, in May, June, July, August, September, and October. And prior to March, we've come to find that since February and January, the federal government was at least aware that this would become an issue, catastrophic issue, and took no action. I am not saying this to be alarmist. I'm not saying this to be edgy. I'm not saying this to be dramatic. Things are bad. Things are going to get worse. I want you to take care of yourself, and I want you to take care of the people that you love. I want you to help me and people like me organize with one another to protect one another and make a better country. One that cares about people, cares about human dignity, cares about human rights, cares about a livable wage for every American. Universal health care, so that we can all enjoy the quality of health care that Donald Trump got when he got COVID-19, not ending up tens of thousands of dollars in debt because of medical bills, or being offered the door because you don't have insurance. We want to fight for a world where every human being has a right to shelter, food, medical care, and education, where we can all be our best selves and build a country that we can all be proud of, to save the planet from an overwhelming climate collapse that's accelerating every day that it goes unmitigated. I want a better world. I want a world we can be proud of. And it's not unrealistic. It's not some pie-in-the-sky hippie dream. It's backed with economics, science, mathematics, and if nothing else, it's the decent thing to do. Join the DSA. Do that for me. Please, do that for me. And then make my day by messaging me or commenting that you have. We're all in this together. And the only way we're going to get out of it is if we act like it. So that's us at an hour. I'm gonna cut it here until whenever. I'm gonna say toodaloo, take care, see you then, bye-bye, all that stuff. And seriously, take care of yourselves. I'll see you next time.